Okay, welcome back, fellow human beings. We are talking today about not Alec Baldwin. About whom are we talking?
James Baldwin.
Yeah, and I have a very interesting person, Ken. He's also a teacher here
Yeah.
in China. You teach economics, basically, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
And he's also very interested in economics and history. And recently I asked him, okay, what's your favorite book? Who's your favorite author? And he said it's James
James
Baldwin.
Baldwin. Yeah.
James Baldwin. And I have to say I'm maybe a bit of a how to say ignorant person
Yeah.
because I didn't know James Baldwin. What did you think when I say I don't know
I
James
mean,
Baldwin?
honestly, I wasn't surprised.
Mm.
I wasn't surprised because I believe that James Baldwin, although he does deserve quite a bit of fame, I think it's the type of author that not everyone knows, and it's okay. I think, but gradually as time goes on, I think he will get more fame
Mhm.
because of the topics that he covers. Most of the topics are very current to the race and social issues we're facing today.
Mm. I mean, to be honest, he was already. Okay, all that I know about James Baldwin, I'm not an expert on James Baldwin. I haven't read any of his books,
Yeah.
but I researched a little bit on the internet, basically Wikipedia knowledge, but now I'm keen to figure out more about James Baldwin. So he was born 1924, and
hmm
I think his major period of working was in the 50s,
I
60s.
would say mostly in the 60s and 70s, a bit in the 50s as well, even though he started in the late 40s.
Mm-hmm.
But I think he didn't really achieve acclaim as a writer until the 1950s.
Mm. So what I wonder, just to get a basic picture of him, why was he so significant for his time?
I think he was significant for his time because he dealt with issues. First of all, I think because of who he was. He was a black man from the United States, and he was not heterosexual. And I think basically based on his demographics and based on who he was, and based on the issues that he had, the topics that he wrote about various social issues and racial issues, and he did not deal with them in a shy way or in a very passive way, but he attacked directly the different social ills that we were facing in the 1950s in the United States and 1960s. So I think that's why he became so famous during that time period.
Yeah, social
Yeah,
ills. So I heard like in the 50s he self-exiled himself.
correct. He self-exiled himself to France until the end of his life in the 1980s.
Oh, until the end of
And
his life,
yeah,
yeah.
he pretty much, I would definitely say, he spent the majority of his life in France.
Mm.
And it was not uncommon during that time period. There are a few other artists, I would say, that did the same thing, such as Josephine Baker
Mhm.
and Nina Simone.
Nina
That they,
Simone, I know.
yeah, exactly. As a
But
music person, huh?
yeah, Nina Simone is a great jazz singer. One of
Exactly,
the greatest
exactly.
of
One of
all
the
time, yeah.
greatest,
Mm.
exactly.
And
Josephine
Josephine Baker?
Baker. Josephine Baker was a dancer and entertainer in the
Oh.
1920s and
Oh.
1930s, and she also self-exiled to France. Um, I wasn't around during that time period, but the impression that I get for certain artists, they wanted the freedom to be themselves. They wanted the freedom to express certain ideas or, there's certain levels of creativity that they believe that they could not attain
Mm.
under the social and racial oppression in the United States as a
Mhm.
black woman or as a black man. That I believe that France gave them an open area and France gave them the space to be themselves.
Mhm.
I cannot speak about what France is like today, but I think during that time period, there were a lot of intellectuals,
Yeah,
French intellectuals. It was an intellectual hotbed. It was an
yeah.
open area. So I think many,
And it seems it
yeah,
was also open for black intellectuals.
yes, exactly.
Like the person that comes to my mind is Frantz
Frantz
Fanon.
Fanon,
Yeah.
exactly, from the French Caribbean.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So yeah, so the question is, which influence did they have on America if they basically spent their time in France?
Because they wrote well, in the case of James Baldwin,
Hmm.
James Baldwin wrote books about the American experience, which one can argue a bit later, the universal experience. But a lot of the books that he wrote were not uniquely, forget about that. They were about the American experience. They were American characters who were living and struggling with American issues, even though he was not there.
Yeah.
And also, James Baldwin was very active in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. He marched with Martin Luther King and so on. And so he
was regularly visiting the United States.
I'm not sure how regularly he visited the United States, but he kept a presence in the United States. He just chose to live and create elsewhere.
And he identified himself as American, or
Of course,
French?
definitely. He identified himself as American.
How could he, okay, maybe that's a very difficult question, but so he self-exiled himself from America.
Correct.
That means he had somehow an anger on America, right? But still he identified himself as American.
Yeah.
So that seems there's a very big tension in his personality then, right?
Exactly. And if you read probably his most famous essay, The Fire Next Time, I'm going to summarize just some key points from that essay. In that essay, he makes it very clear to the reader that regardless of your race, whether you're black or white, you are American and you have a duty and a connection to each other, that no matter where you are in the world and no matter how you identify yourself, the simple fact that you share this land and you've shared it for a long time, you're bound together. And your race or your social class, it's irrelevant. And that you cannot really blame white people for their ignorance of the racial issue. You understand? They themselves are also victims. They're victims of, so to speak, a bad messaging that was brought to them, bad information from their parents and grandparents and so on and so on. But essentially, we're all the victim. As Americans, we're all victims of this common ignorance.
Yeah.
And we're bound together. And until we can rectify it together, there is no future for us.
Okay.
So it's
very controversial, right? Like,
yeah.
Because he says like white people, I'm sorry that I focus immediately and jump on that, but he says white people are also victims.
Yeah.
If you said that today in the discourse, wouldn't people immediately jump on you and say?
Of course, because the discourse now has moved towards the fact that white people have benefited from certain institutionalized racism and various factors that black people have not. But I think that he's not just interested in the economic outcome or the material outcome of being American, but actually the sense of belonging and the sense of unity and the sense of we are American. I think that's where I would defend him in that camp.
So we have to see it from the larger question of what it means to be American.
Correct.
And only then the question of race comes into the picture, or am I seeing that wrong?
So I'm going to even extend this question a bit for you. Now, being Jamaican, right, and having been raised in the United States.
So you grew up in
Florida.
In Florida,
yeah.
Not Miami.
Exactly.
In Miami.
No, in Orlando.
Orlando, yeah.
But having lived in Europe and Asia and spending time in Africa, I start to understand that the United States is not the only American identity, but one could argue that Canadians, Americans, Caribbeans, Mexicans, South Americans, we do share one common American identity.
Oh, okay, yeah.
You understand?
Yeah, we talked about that before. Like also you said like that South America is very similar to the idea of North America, where just different cultures came together.
Correct.
And built the foundation for a state,
Correct.
which is very different from what we maybe have in the European states
or in
maybe
Africa or in Asia. Because, so to me, that's why James Baldwin is important to me. Not only because he's an American, was a United States citizen, but because I think he does speak for the entire experience of being a continental American.
Oh yeah.
Do you understand?
And would you say this experience applies to white people who have been the oppressors and to like people of color in the same way, or how would you see that?
Can you ask me the question one more time? I want to understand your question
Yeah, you
before
say
I make a good
there's a
response.
common American experience,
Common
right?
American experience,
Yeah.
yeah, from the north straight down to the south.
Yeah.
And perhaps I should give you a bit more details about why
Yeah.
I say that, so that the
Yeah.
question can have more
Because for me, it
context.
just like jumps into my mind, and I think what other people could say, because we have colonizers
Yeah.
and slave owners,
Yeah.
for example, who benefited from the history, and usually their skin color is white,
Correct.
right? And then we have black people, but now you talk about a common American experience, and maybe
Correct.
we can distinguish that with also with regard to these complicated questions a bit.
Yeah. So to define what I call the common American experience, I will just give you a foundation. So across the Americas, we had, natives. We had the Native Americans, the American Indian, stretching from Alaska all the way down to Chile and Argentina. Then you had an introduction of Europeans who basically came for the purpose of colonization, exploitation, profit, gain. So in our case, it was mostly the British, the French, Spanish, Portuguese, to a lesser extent the Dutch.
Mm-hmm.
And they
Why
then,
to a lesser extent?
to a lesser extent, because the Dutch did not have many colonies in the Americas. They just had New York, New Amsterdam,
Okay.
and a few territories in the Caribbean and South America.
Mm-hmm.
They then brought African labor from West and Central Africa, and they basically used African labor, slaves, with the native population for the purpose of creating economic, so whether it be sugarcane, whether it be cotton, basically they use them to make money, to speak directly.
Yeah.
And slavery ended across this continent, or both continents, in the beginning of the 19th century. But what we've seen since the end of slavery, all of us had slavery, and what we've seen is those who were the colonizers and those who were the so-called oppressors and those who were the so-called oppressed. We've had uniquely difficult relationship between the two groups. How do these two groups reconcile the past? How do these two groups bargain with each other for a better future? There's a social dynamic that we share. And whether you're a Cuban, whether you're Brazilian, whether you're Afro-Cuban, Afro-Brazilian, Afro-American, you have this idea that you were the so-called underclass, the so-called oppressed. And now, this world has been created by these descendants of Europeans. Yes. And how do you make a place for yourself in these societies where the institutions and the social understandings, whether they be formal or informal institutions, they're dominated by this group? How do you make a place for yourself?
Yeah.
And I think that's what James Baldwin addresses.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, totally, right? And how these different races or different people with different histories, maybe not just races, can deal with the past. But there's still a past of somebody who was the oppressor and somebody who was the oppressed, right? So the common experience that both of them have, or that ties them together, is still an unbalanced relationship.
An unbalanced relationship. Yeah. That's the best way of putting it.
I mean, I would like to ask one question. I mean, so as I see it, and you can correct me on that if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
So like the Europeans came as the oppressors who then employed slave labor. But I think later there were also many Europeans escaping.
And exactly. And I think that's what makes it so complex, especially, well, yes, you're right. There were Europeans escaping from Eastern Europe and Italy in particular because of and Ireland because of poverty and religious persecution and so on. But we see this primarily in Canada, the United States, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay. That's where you see more of this. But at the same time, can one argue that they have benefited from the fact that the original oppressors, the French, Portuguese, Spanish, British, shared the same background, racial background that they do. Can we argue that they have benefited from that?
Yeah, I would say we can argue. We can argue that they benefited from the existing power structures that were already established and ingrained in the history.
Exactly.
At the same time, they also made experiences of integrating themselves in a society that maybe does not want them.
And it's true, they did not want them. Especially in the United States, it was a fact that the Irish faced discrimination, the Polish faced discrimination, the Italians faced discrimination. They didn't want them. But within a few generations, it's all forgotten.
Yeah. Or is it forgotten? Like, what do you mean by forgotten?
All forgotten in the sense that they've integrated.
Polish, okay.
They've integrated into the white American experience.
I see what it is. Yeah.
So one could argue that it may be that, naturally as human beings, it's a bit difficult for us to integrate those who are different from us. So in the case of the United States, the foundation is Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And of course, other Europeans are not Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And of course, people of West African and Central African descent are even further from that. Maybe one could argue that because of the closer, integration takes time for anyone. Full integration takes time it naturally would take time. But one could possibly argue that in the long run, perhaps Black people will fully become equal to whites. But it may take a bit longer because there are so many cultural idiosyncrasies and informal institutional idiosyncrasies that are incompatible with the Anglo-Saxon Protestant way.
Yeah, it's an integration of different speeds.
Different speeds, exactly.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I haven't thought about that in this way before, and we could say that at least for the Irish, as I understand you, or the Polish and Italians that escaped forms of religious oppression or forms of poverty that resulted from that they could integrate faster. And that's how I also always understand America, and we have talked about before. America is somehow a culture, and I just speak about the United States as that is my experience. It's a culture that says, we want to integrate you. We want to have a culture that is based on different identities.
I'm not sure it's like that anymore, but that is the American idea.
Yeah, well, I mean, I experienced that in the cities.
Yeah,
right?
Of course.
But of course, it seems there's also an integration of different speeds, as we said, or a different levels, one could say. Yeah?
Correct.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Yeah, so we haven't yet talked too much about the book. This was basically just the introduction, but I think we stop here at this time, and then we go on in the next session and talk more about the book in particular.
Of course.
And discuss some themes. I think this was very interesting to hear all of these backgrounds. I feel, not you, but I feel we still just stayed on the surface.
Yeah,
right? There's
very
so
much
many questions that come to my mind.
Very much.
So if you have any questions that I maybe should have asked, right, then maybe you leave that in the comments. I'm not sure yet where I post that, right?
Yeah.
Probably on YouTube and at some other channels. But I would be happy if you let us know what you think and which questions we should have asked. So far, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
It was really intense.
Yeah.
Like intense to get to know like these historical backgrounds of this person. And I can say that after our discussion, we haven't discussed yet all of it. I will definitely read that book to see what it is all about. So thank you very much and goodbye.